Hello. Sometimes when we hear a topic for a show, an idea for a show, it takes us days, weeks to talk about it, figure out whether we would really want to do it. In the case of today's show, it took us about 2 seconds the minute we heard about this. We wanted to do this show. The Connecticut Department of Mental Health and Addiction Services is sponsoring the kickoff tonight of the Connecticut Hearing Voices Network. That'll be at Real Artways in Hartford. It'll be part of International Hearing Voices Network. That's a network of support groups for people who hear voices and sometimes see visions and have other unusual perceptions. There's going to be a reception tonight. We'll tell you about that. But this really caught our interest, that, in fact, there are people who hear voices who do not believe that that means that they need medication, people who hear voices who believe that that experience of hearing voices can be folded into a more or less normal existence. We want to learn a lot more about that, so let me just tell you who's here today. Peter Bullimore is here with us. He is a voice hearer, and he's, as he says, proud. He owns a training consultant agency, Asylum Associates, and is a founding member of the Paranoia Network in England. Lisa Forrestal is a counselor at Western Mass Learning Recovery Community. Dr. Raveen Mahendru is a psychiatrist at the Institute of Living at Hartford Hospital and assistant medical director of adult services. Later on in the show, because, a big part of this, one of the places this comes up a lot, obviously, is in religious experience. So later on in the show, Janet Ruffing, who's a sister of mercy and a professor in the practice of spirituality and ministerial leadership at Yale Divinity School, will be joining us from the studios down at Yale. But first of all, we want to kind of just lay out the groundwork of what it is that we're talking about here. So, Peter Bullimore, I'll start with you. What does it mean to say you hear voices?
For me, it's a very personal experience. It differs from person to person. But for me, my voices are a reminder of things in my life that I needed to address. They're a part of me. They're emotions that became suppressed when I was a young child through childhood sexual abuse and neglect that became overwhelming. So quite often when they talk about negative things, it's very difficult to hear. But often we were doing is they were talking about areas of my life that I needed to deal with. Unless I dealt with them, I couldn't recover, and all medication did was suppress those emotions. So my recovery was disabled by about 10 years. So
I just want to sort of pin this down a little bit more. So, for example, do you hear voices every day?
24 hours a day, 7 days a week, yes.
All right. And they are speaking words, right? They are saying discernible words and sentences.
Yes.
So, and what are the kinds of words that they say? I mean, is it a kind of a running commentary on what your daily life is, or is it very separate from what's going on?
It's really variable. Initially, did talk about the abuse that I suffered. Mm-hmm. My abuse finished when I was 13 years of age, and my primary abusers were female. So my body was responding to abuse. So they would say it was my fault. They'd call me a sex case, a paedophile. That's how they made me feel. Mm-hmm. But I looked at it later in life with the help of the Hearing Voices movement. That actually they're metaphors. They're talking about areas of my life that I haven't dealt with. We talk about voices being messengers that bring awful messages, but we say at times, don't shoot the messenger. They've got something important to say. Currently, the main voice will often call me a murderer. That's about guilt, about the death of my mother and my son that I haven't dealt with. They're reminding me that I have to go there eventually to deal with it. So although the messages may sound very difficult, when you look into the context of the person's journey, they start to make sense.
So they're talking to you then about sort of major existential issues in your life, as opposed to, were they talking to you today about how you're going to go on a radio show and how that's going to be, or is it more these other kinds of sort of historic and massive issues in your life?
Well, to be honest with you, I've not listened to them today because, I'm coming onto this radio show and what they've got to say is currently important. Your listeners and yourself is more important. So I pushed them to the background so I can focus on what I need to be able to do.
And you can do that. You actually have sort of the equivalent of a volume control?
Yes.
Yeah. And how long did it take you to develop that?
I started to do that when I got out of services and people asked me about my narrative. Rather than just telling me I was mentally ill and I got schizophrenia, nobody talked about the voices. And I changed the relationship with them. We have to remember it takes two people to maintain a conflict. Sometimes you've got to listen to the other person's point of view.
Now, you say it takes two people to maintain a conflict. Ultimately, this is you, right? I mean, the voices are you. They're not some extraneous source.
I don't believe so. And I think there are areas in my life that I hadn't dealt with, and the voices reminded me of that. And by just arguing against them and fighting all the time wasn't going anywhere. I had to look to the real meaning of the voices and reform the relationship with them.
When you say voices, too, is it? I'm trying to just imagine the auditory experience of this. So, is it voices that seem assignable to specific personalities? Is it just a cacophony of voices, each one kind of different from the other? Or?
It's different for me. I hear three externally through my right ear, and now they were the people that abused me as a child. I hear the voice of my dead mother, who's been dead for quite a long time now, and she makes very accurate predictions within my life. And I hear another voice, which I think is my creative side that got crushed through childhood experiences, and that voice was very helpful. It helped me write a children's book. But when the book got published, the voice disappeared.
Our other authors have had that experience too. I think Philip K. Dick among them, who heard a specific female voice for a lot. I think starting in his teenage years and going into his writing career, Philip K. Dick, who probably is the most per words written movie adapted author in the history of at least the English language anyway. But he some of his creativity, and you hear this over and over again, whether it's him or Robert Schumann, who was having a considerably less pleasant experience, that for creative people often they do hear voices.
Yeah, I think so, and I couldn't have wrote the book without the voice.
Lisa, I want to hear about you. Is everything that Peter describing very familiar to you, or are you having a very specifically different experience?
My experience is quite different, although the commonality with Peter is what really hearing voices is so important to me. I've had the same three voices for as long as I can remember, and I consider them my companions. They're very individual voices. They are participatory, I guess is the best term for it. And two of them stayed young, and one grew up with me. The two young ones are very playful, and they keep me in touch with my playfulness. And the one that grew up with me is my consult. He advises me and keeps me straight, I think. Hearing voices was one of the first ways that I realized that I'm actually in the majority of people who hear voices and don't feel as though they need psychiatric support around it. So my voices and I had a pact very young when we started getting negative messages from other people that our experience was not appreciated. We made a pact to not talk about it. So part of the nervousness, other than being on the radio, is that we readdressed that pact only about 4 years ago for the purposes of really getting out there with the Hearing Voices Network and letting people know that we are not alone, and that being together and hearing one another's experiences and what that is for us is part of what makes us strong and figure out how to tell our stories.
So I just want to make sure I understand that. In order to decide to go public about your own experience of hearing voices, you had to more or less call a meeting of you and your voices.
Oh, we definitely had a conversation, and the vote was not unanimous.
It was not unanimous. There was a voice who didn't want to do this.
The girls did not want to do this.
Yeah.
No.
So you're more than just a tiebreaker then, it sounds like.
It's an ongoing conversation.
Yeah.
Yeah. But I get the final vote.
And so your experience, the experience that you're describing is, I think, less, it sounds to me anyway, less harrowing in some ways than Peter's early experiences with people calling him murderer and things like that. And I guess those experiences aren't entirely over, at least in that way, all the time. But that's not what's happening to you. You're describing a more companionable relationship.
Yeah. I mean, we've definitely had arguments and all, but no, I haven't had voices that would that I've never ever felt like I needed help with. We've had fallings outs and different squabbles and such, but they've always been with me. So I've never been particularly startled by what they've had to say or felt as though I couldn't go about my daily activities. It never has really gotten in the way, which is not to say it hasn't been a very different experience than people that don't identify as voice hearers.
And are you Peter sort of talks a little bit about the genesis of this, how this seems to stem or have something to do, stem from or have something to do with abuse in his childhood. Is that the case for you? Do you understand anyway or think you understand where this comes from or why you're having this experience?
Yeah, I think maybe I alluded to that just in the introduction of what my voices and I are. We're companions. And I could probably explain that in a couple different frameworks. a medical framework doesn't work at all for me at all. A trauma framework does to an extent, but I don't feel as though my voices are a creation of my experience or an extrapolation of my experience. They truly are separate souls that I hear and other people don't, just as you're a separate soul that everybody else is hearing along with me.
So it sounds almost like you're not really especially interested in some kind of clinical explanation on what this is all about.
I'm actually I get a little bit upset about that,
Yeah.
actually. It just feels like it gets in the way from us understanding our experiences.
And you're not interested in changing or not having these voices, right?
I have never once considered not having my voices and trying to be rid of them.
How about you, Peter? If I could give you a pill that's starting tomorrow, you just never hear these voices again. Yes, no?
No, I'd be devastated not to hear my voices.
Really?
Yeah.
And last question for you, Lisa, before we move on, I want to hear from our third guest here. But one of the things that you cited, and I'm not sure where this number comes from, but I came across it several times in the reading for the show, that 2/3 of the people who hear voices have not sought medical attention, do not think they need medical attention. That's the number you're alluding to anyway, right?
Yeah.
And do we know where that comes from, or where that...
Actually, it came from a talk show like this one.
Well, then it has to be true. It's absolutely...
And then actually a lot of research that was compelled by that. But it was a talk show, Donahue or Oprah-esque, where there was a call-in center afterwards and a request from a psychiatrist and his partner patient trying to figure out what voice hearing was, to have a bunch of people call in and identify themselves as voice hearers. Those calls were followed up with questions about what their experience was for them. And it was the first time psychiatry really had a window to the people that are not seeking psychiatric help. And 2/3 of the callers didn't feel as though voices were presenting any sort of struggle in their lives.
So, Raveen Mahendru, a lot of clinicians who might be sitting in the chair that you're sitting in right now might see this. I mean, there are a lot of different ways to see this, obviously. But, I mean, if you're going to just look at the DSM-5, a person's having auditory hallucinations, if you're going to just diagnose that way, boom, you're automatically into a certain area, right?
Well, let me go back a little before I answer that question. So, firstly, we are agreeing this is a hallucination. So if this is a hallucination, one symptom does not make a diagnosis.
They may not be. Let me just. I don't mean to. Right. Do you agree it's a hallucination? Is that a word that you would use?
No, I wouldn't. I'd call it. I actually hear voice. It's not an hallucination. It's real to me, and I think to say it's an hallucination actually dismisses the person's belief system.
Right. How about you? Hallucination?
Absolutely not.
Okay. Just making sure we don't agree.
All right. Yes. But let me also define what I mean by hallucination. It is the perception of a percept as if it were real. I am not denying that you are hearing the voices and you are hearing them as real voices. That's my definition of a hallucination. That means that I don't appreciate whose voice it is. I don't appreciate the sound and the voice either, but I do appreciate that you're experiencing them. That would be the definition of a hallucination. Going back to what I was saying, which is that one symptom won't make a diagnosis, number one. Number two, over the course of decades in psychiatry, this is well known that a symptom will not diagnose anything. It has to be a conglomeration of symptoms occurring together. To Lisa's point, my reading of this literature indicates about 15% of the population reports having auditory hallucinations or auditory verbal perceptions without actually having a psychiatric illness. The psychiatric literature is actually becoming more cognizant of that, and there's a lot of research going in because of the difference in the types of phenomena that you would see as would be associated with schizophrenia versus with no schizophrenia being evident. So what I'm also trying to imply there is that a person is hearing voices need not have schizophrenia or another psychiatric illness. We are talking independent of an illness. And now the research that's being done is taking into account those individuals who are having those kinds of phenomena and studying that both with different types of cognitive and biological testing.
By the way, if people want to ask questions about this or make comments, 860-275-7266. This is our subject the whole way. So 860-275-7266. On the other hand, don't take that as a reason to wait too long. So I like what you're saying, and you could be my psychiatrist, and I'd be quite happy. But, I'm just wondering, but I am going to ask you now to speak perhaps irresponsibly, for the broader profession. If I walk into an emergency room or a clinic or even, a pretty good psychiatric facility, and I say I'm hearing voices,
correct,
what are the chances I'm going to get a Dr. Naveen Mahendru who's going to sort of see that the way that you just explained it? And what are the chances I'm going to be diagnosed as psychotic or schizophrenic or blah, 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 blah?
All right. So that's an interesting question. So if you were to walk just to show you some statistics, on a given day in our ERs, less than 5% of patients are actually admitted. They are evaluated and discharged from the ER itself, some with a diagnosis, some with a pre-existing diagnosis, and some with, there's probably no problem here, you need to go and do X, Y, and Z. With regard to what would be the norm would again come to that the issue would be how that symptom or symptom syndrome is actually influencing the functioning of the person. If there is a gross impairment in reality testing, if there is a gross impairment in ability to look after oneself, that's the point at which we would suggest intervention. Now, even there is a dichotomy. You can suggest intervention, the person may not accept it, and you may actually have to let them say, go. Then there is another aspect, which would be that the gross impairment is so severe that they are inadvertently posing a threat to their own safety because of reality testing issues. At that point, you may want to actually involuntarily hospitalize that. Now, that would probably comprise less than 1% of the admissions.
I want to ask the hearers how your experience has been with. You're both in kind of a post-psychiatric model now, right? It's kind of you've worked out your own way of dealing with this, and you've worked out your own understanding of this. But Peter, I'm assuming that was a long journey, and that you did interact with the clinical establishment. I'm assuming in England rather than here. How does it work? I mean, if you say you hear voices, what happens?
Well, I guess just to pick on a couple of points that were said before, if 15% of the population hear voices, that's more common than asthma. 10% of the population have asthma. And when you use the word syndrome, if you look at the recent work of Reid and Argyll, it shows that 90 to 92% of people receiving psychiatric care have had a traumatic life experience. That can be very variable. So why don't we talk about reactions rather than pathologizing human behavior? And for me, the problem was I spent 10 years in services, from what happened in childhood, dealing with it, owning £1 million business, going into services. During a 10-year stay, not one person ever asked me about my life. The most important question you've got to ask someone is, how have you got here? That is not bus, taxi or ambulance. What has happened in your life to bring you to services? Because if we don't ask that question, we go straight to diagnosis. And in our psychiatric care today, the average time it takes someone to disclose, if not asked, is 16 years. That's a long time out of someone's life. So we need to be asking about the person's journey, understand the narrative, understand the context of the voices. So for me, I lost 10 years of my life that could have been evaluated and worked through a lot earlier.
I want to make sure I'm idiomatically on point here. So when you say services, that's is that you're saying in treatment? Is that what that's what that means? Okay,
yeah,
what we would call in treatment. So Lisa, I would just also want to say I'm just also sort of wondering. I mean, here just experientially, if you listen to people, the way people talk about things like this, I'm not talking about the clinical establishment. I'm just talking about people. Usually, somebody who's hearing voices, if you tell people you're hearing voices, it's a lot of people just immediately, their minds go to the idea, well, she's crazy, right? That's what crazy people hear voices, right?
Absolutely. I mean, the news outlets and media are really, really reinforcing the one flew over the cuckoo's nest kind of idea of what it is to I don't know, live our lives out loud. And that's really concerning. Definitely one of the reasons, well, the main reason why I chose not to talk about my voice hearing. But then if you can actually have a conversation around it, and people realize that, in many points of their lives they could identify as voice hearers, that they too have had some experience that that wouldn't have been heard by the person sitting next to them. It makes it a much more approachable thing. So half the battle is being able to talk about it from a human place, rather than putting assumptions on what the experience can be for people.
How does it affect close interpersonal relationships? I mean, I have enough trouble maintaining my close interpersonal relationship with neither one of us hearing voices besides each other's voices. I would imagine this is a challenge, I mean, whether it's a friendship or a romantic relationship or a marriage or whatever, you're hearing something the other person's not hearing. You're having an experience. If you're both sitting on the sofa, you're having different experiences. I guess you could sort of say that about all people, but you're having a specifically different experience.
Yeah. I think when I was choosing not to tell anybody about my voices, it was much more difficult than it is now. Because I'm transparent about it, somebody will just feel comfortable saying, did you just hear something that I didn't? And I can say yes or no and explain what it was for me. So being out about it has been way more comfortable and less energy sucking.
Yeah. May I add
go ahead.
something to what Peter said? And I think the other question that we want to ask is not only what's been the context, it's also why now. Why is it coming to our attention at this point? What has happened that has brought somebody to our attention again? I think that answers a lot of the type of intervention that would then be recommended or suggested. And we failed to ask that question quite a number of times. You're right about that. We were talking prior to this program. The fragmentation starts there too.
Well, it's some of it also, I don't know. I'm so unqualified to make the observation I'm about to make. But I feel as though more and more over the last 5 years even, you hear more conversations about neurodiversity, and I suppose psychodiversity could come into that too, that the idea that there isn't a locus, a single place you can put your finger on that's normal, and then a continuum that spreads out from there towards insanity, and that everybody can be placed along that continuum, it's a much more kind of sliding set of measurements.
Well, that's a philosophical question, though. And it's a philosophical answer to that, too. There has to be a wide variety of spectrum. Even from a very reductionist point of view of genetics, once we know the human genome issue and we know how genes are acting with each other, the possibility is large, and hence the variety should be large also. Hence the spectrum of normalcy may be a little different than what we are used to. But going back to one point that you had made earlier, which is that people find it odd when you tell somebody I'm hearing voices, but they don't find it odd when you say I believe in aliens. They can talk about UFOs and stuff. It's easier to talk about that than to talk about, tell me more about your voices.
I talk to myself. I have elaborate conversations with myself. I don't think I'm hearing any voice. I'm just talking to myself. But I mean, people who come upon me doing this often have a reaction to that. To me, it's part of having been an only child, and there was often nobody else to talk to. But anyway, I can.
But I think everybody talks to themselves to a certain extent.
To a certain degree. I maybe get a little bit more. I mean, I'm like the Charlie Rose show or something.
Okay.
Anyway, but I'm not actually hearing a voice. Let me grab one call. Yeah. Then I want to take a break. I want to just bring Janet in for the religious part of this, and then we'll have a whole third segment. We can talk a little bit more about what we're talking about now. This is like a 4-hour show. I would like to have a lot more time to talk about this. But here's Mark in East Hampton. Hi, Mark.
Hi, how you doing, Colin? Thanks
Fine.
for having me on. I'll really try to quick tell my story. I know you got to go to break. I've been hearing voices my whole life. Like your guest, I had the pact that we didn't tell anybody. The sole proprietor of a business. Was doing fine for many years. Got severely injured a few years ago. And while in the hospital on a lot of pain medicine, I kind of broke the pact. They had sent somebody from their psychiatry department to see me because I basically lost everything after the injury. Thought I was really depressed. Anyways, fast forward, had a lot of testing and stuff done, And now they're trying to tell me, I know there was childhood trauma, but now they're trying to diagnose me as dissociative identity disorder. They're telling me it's going to be years of therapy before I can even think about going to work again. It's kind of ridiculous. They seem to have gone off the edge here. And I'm wondering what your guests think about all that.
Well, I think Dr. Mahendru is not going to want to make a curbside diagnosis, but our other two guests might want to say something. So basically, just to recap quickly, you've been hearing voices pretty much all your life, or for
yes.
but then you had this accident. You made perhaps the mistake of telling somebody, some clinician or something, that you heard voices, and suddenly you're on some very different track in terms of treatment. I don't know. Either one of you want to?
Yeah, I think it's going back to what we were saying about why now. I think it's an important question.
Yeah.
We know dissociative identity disorder can be caused by a childhood trauma. When you had the was it a road traffic accident or something you had?
I was owner operator of a truck, and I fell off it.
Right.
I broke my back. I was paralyzed for a while.
But what it does, it raises those disempowering moments that happen when you were a child. So quite often we're back in that moment. So it's very difficult to understand the situation. We have something called infantism. So basically, it's a child that cannot cope. You're back to the age when the trauma started, and it's a classic case of the resurfing of the past disempowerment. And actually, you don't have to be years in therapy. It needs to be working with the inner child, and you can be out of there in a lot quicker than what they say. Then it will be years.
One thing you might think about doing, Mark, is tonight is this kickoff of the Connecticut Hearing Voices Network. These networks, both of our guests here are part of these networks, but these networks exist in other places. I guess now there's going to be one here in Connecticut, the Connecticut Hearing Voices Network. If you could get over to Real Artways tonight, it looks like the event is from 5:30 to 9 p.m. Peter and Lisa are both going to be part of that. And so at least, you could sort of rub shoulders with a lot of other people who are having the same experience. That might be worth doing. And Lisa, I assume, and I know this, you don't live in Connecticut, but I assume this network stays around and it's there for people in Connecticut who are having that experience.
Yeah, that's really what we're trying to support here is the development of the Connecticut network. But we also meet over the phone and Skype and internet, and really trying to encourage it all the way across the USA. And you can check out hearingvoicesusa.org for more about that.
All right. I'm going to grab a quick break here. I do want to just address the religious component of this, and then we got a ton of calls from Don and Betty and Valentina. We will get to those too.
Thank you for hearing me. Thank you for hearing me. Thank you for hearing me.
All right. I'm suddenly realizing that the whole experience of hearing voices is not that unlike doing a talk radio show. For example, I hear voices counting me in and stuff like that you guys are not hearing. All right. So when we first started talking about doing the show, one of my first reactions was I really want to talk about the religious part of this because even though we might in daily life talk about hearing voices, some people would talk about it as something that's very atypical. One of the places that it seems accepted and understood and very much part of the discourse is within the world of religion. So joining us right now is Janet Ruffing, a sister of mercy and a professor in the practice of spirituality and ministerial leadership at Yale Divinity School. So you've been listening to this conversation, Janet Ruffing, and obviously, your thoughts probably go a little bit towards some saints, right? Teresa of Avila, Catherine of Siena. These are people who heard voices.
Yes, my thoughts do go there, but I'm fascinated by this topic because I actually did qualitative research years ago on contemporary people who experienced what we called mystical locutions, which are mystical experiences. And people who have these experiences are mystified by them. They're afraid to talk about them because hearing voices has been so pathologized. And the effect of these voices that people hear are entirely positive. So they're not dissociative phenomenon, but it requires a belief that one is actually being in some kind of actual communication with God. And much to my surprise, in this very small sample that I had interviewed, a full half of the participants had some kinds of hearing of voices.
You know, we talk about this also, I think, pastorally, we talk about it. I mean, when often if we're talking to, say, a young person whose parent has died or something like that, we might say, you can talk to her, you know, you can, and she'll hear you, and you may. I mean, it is sort of part of our understanding, right, that not everybody that we talk to is located physically, corporeally here on Earth.
Yes, and that there's some kind of spirit existence beyond the present life. So that's part of the frame of reference. It's also, in terms of most of the people that I actually interviewed, the words they heard, most of them, they were like a single sentence that was illuminating, consoling, strengthening, and that changed them on the spot. And they remembered it and lived out of that experience. So these auditory experiences have the same kinds of effects that visions have for other people where there are no words. And they would never categorize them as hallucinatory because they occurred rarely or once, and they were convinced that there was a communication going on between themselves and God or someone from the spiritual world. So in the mystical tradition, that's technically called a locution. And both Teresa of Avila and John of the Cross had extensive teachings about when these kinds of words happened, which ones came, how to distinguish those that came from God and the effects they had on you, if that was the case, and when they came from some part of yourself or from some other entity, or when this person was severely depressed and they were to be completely disregarded if that was the case. So even in the 16th century, they had psychiatric categories for this. In that time of, at that time of history. Teresa of Avila felt very dependent on the words she heard because she had such limitations in terms of the books she had access to. And when all the books were burned that had given her help spiritually, she was praying to God and said something like, now what am I going to do? Everything that's ever helped me is gone. And her voice was Jesus, who said, Teresa, do not worry, I will be a living book to you.
Now, this is not confined to the experience of Catholic saints, right? I mean, we look at we look at George Fox, who's the founder of the Quakers. He talks about an inner life, and Gandhi talks about hearing something audible, a voice talking to him. This happens, cuts across traditions, right?
It does. It's there's a mystical version of it, but it's also related to prophecy. So, for instance, Muhammad heard the whole Quran dictated to him. Mm-hmm. That's a pretty long voice,
Right, that's a long conversation.
That's a pretty powerful one. But then also in terms of prophecy, of the folks I particularly interviewed, a couple of them identified them as a prophetic word, distinguishing what's for the person who receives a communication and what's for some other community. So for one person, it was her Episcopal Church community. For another one, it was her religious community. So a particular person becomes a vehicle for communicating that. And, of course, in the Jewish tradition, we have the prophets of the Old Testament. So, yes, so there's a prophetic form, and then there's this mystical form.
I want to just turn it over to Dr. Mahendru for a second. One of the things we hear over and over again when we're in studying Erik Erikson or somebody like that is cultural context is really important. And so what's a hallucination, what's a psychotic experience in one cultural context is a shamanic experience, a legitimate communication. People who have those kinds of experience in other cultures are prized and are sometimes regarded as the wisest or the most useful people in their respective cultures. Cultural context has a lot to say about how we define an experience like this one.
Yes. However, here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to give you an opinion which you may not be familiar with.
Okay.
when I talk of culture, I talk more. I have worked in two different cultures, India and the U.S., and I can tell you that I see the same phenomena in both cultures. In fact, I saw some in England. I was there for a little bit. It's how we deal with it which is the main issue. But what you're describing, for example, the religious, we see it in India. We sometimes treat them as saints and sometimes treat them as madmen and then sometimes treat them as patients for the same phenomena. So I think it's independent of culture. I think what's important with regard to culture is the toleration, the amount of people are ready to tolerate or are ready to ascribe some meaning to it. I think in the West there is now less tolerance to this kind of situation, whereas in the East we may still actually do more of the acknowledging that this may be some supernatural ability of the person. I think that's the main issue with culture, from my point of view. And I know it doesn't go down well with people who like to talk about cross-cultural issues, because I think a lot of this is biologically driven in the sense that we have the same biology across Earth. So for us to have similar phenomena, the culture really comes into play into how we tolerate it rather than saying that there are different phenomena in different cultures.
We're going to take a quick break. Believe me, I could talk about this segment for an hour, but we want to thank Janet Ruffing, Sister of Mercy and professor at Yale Divinity School. We're going to move on. We've got a lot of calls here. I want to come back to our other guests, our hearers in the studio. You can call us 860-275-7266.
Do you hear what I hear?
Do you hear what I hear?
Ringing through the sky, shepherd boy. Do you hear what I hear?
Do you hear what I hear?
A song, high above the tree, with a voice as big as the sea. With a voice as big as the sea.
Today's show was produced by Betsy Kaplan and me. Our interns are Jane Ashley and Greg Andrew Lischke. The part of Bill Curry was played by Anthony Hopkins. Katie Tolarski is our executive producer. For show pages, articles, videos, and more of everything, visit our great website, WNPR.org. On tomorrow's show, the fastest, deepest, hottest, and oldest creatures in the ocean. And now, back to Colin.
All right, so we're talking about hearing voices. Our guests include Dr. Raveen Mahendru. You've been just hearing him speak. Also in studio with me, Peter Bullimore, a voice hearer. Lisa Forrestal, a voice hearer. They've both been involved with these networks of people who are voice hearers. So I want to ask a little bit more about what that's like. Peter Bullimore, when you get a group together, a group of people who hear voices, and one thing we've already established is that everybody's voice hearing experience is probably a little bit different from everybody else's. It's an individualized thing. But what happens if 5, 10, 15 people who are voice hearers sit down together and talk? What do they talk about?
Well, initially, it's a very liberating experience. It breaks down the social isolation, that they're not alone with this experience. They'll talk about the content of the voices, what brought them to service, how we can help each other, support each other, exchange coping strategies. And just basically, when we get into these support groups, it's a safe place where you can take off a mask that you've been wearing for years, because within society, you're told not to tell people you hear voices. You meet people on psychiatric wards, they never talk about the experience because they want to get out of there. So in general, in our group, we actually had 21 there the other week, and it was a fantastic experience. People talked about what they saw as beliefs, what saw as a spiritual context, what they saw as related to life events. But we looked at very much about problem solving. How can we move you on to the next stage? But basically respect your understanding of them.
I'm also wondering, Lisa, once again, when you get people together like this, you said that you had to pretty much call a meeting with your voices and have a conversation about whether to go public at all, whether to talk about this stuff. I would imagine not everybody's voices agree about whether to go to the meeting, whether to talk to other people in a network.
I suppose that's very individual for everybody.
Yeah.
I think what's really interesting about our meetings is that they come from, we create a very non-judgmental place. So the idea of normal and then a span of to abnormal just simply doesn't exist. And it really offers an opportunity for people to come and share their story with their own language and with their own understanding. And that's the only way you find out whether or not they've had to negotiate with their voices or not to get there.
All right, I want to just, we've got a lot of calls here. I want to take a few of them. We're going to start with Ken, who I think is a clinician. Hi, Ken.
Yes, hi, Colin. Just a brief comment. I first wanted to congratulate Peter and Lisa, how courageous it is to do a show like this. It was only a short time ago where people had to keep all this behind closed doors and within themselves. So they already commented on the sense of isolation and loneliness that generated. I think what they're appealing to us as psychiatrists, as I'm one for the state, is to hear my experience, to not invalidate it immediately, so that also I not feel disempowered, to listen and truly hear their voice first. Not the voices that they're hearing, but first to hear their voice and their understanding of what it is they're experiencing. That we have to consider the context in which they're experiencing their voices before we do any diagnosing at all, so as to not to invalidate and disempower what people are experiencing.
You know, Ken, I just want to ask you, follow up with you about this a little bit too, and it's sort of something we've touched upon a few times here. But listening to these two guests, one of the things that I'm thinking is, if I were in their shoes, if I heard voices, one of the questions I'd be asking myself, and following today's conversation, I'd be asking it in a slightly different way, is, should I ever deal with anybody like you? Maybe I should. It's almost like Alcoholics Anonymous a little bit, you know, that ultimately they decide they've got a different, better for them model than a standard clinical treatment model. But, you know, should I go to a psychiatrist ever? If there's a chance I'm going to be misunderstood, defined the wrong way, there's going to be a file on me that says a certain set of things. I mean, you know, Dr. Mahendra is great. Ken, you sound great. But I feel like I'd be taking a big chance. Maybe I'd be better off coping with this in kind of a post-psychiatric way. What's your reaction to that?
Is that for Ken?
It was for Ken, but I think you might have hung up, so you can answer it.
Well, so the point I think that I want to bring across is twofold. Number one is the fact that we're talking about two different types of situations in which this kind of a phenomena is occurring. One is where it's in the context of more global problems versus is an isolated kind of a phenomena. Mm-hmm. I think going to a psychiatrist or going to a professional would be entertained because it may be disturbing somebody, but it may actually also create a situation where they may get a more, if they are heard properly, like Peter says, create a situation where there's more reassuring information that this may not be really an illness, but just an isolated phenomena. It may not be a persistent issue. I think the second point is this, that people go to a mental health professional if they are feeling distress. And if they don't get the advice that they are looking for, they change or they stop going. So there is that autonomy involved in that decision. So, you know, I think the person has to decide whether they want the help or not, or whether this is a situation that requires help or not, and hence end up going to the right person.
May I say a word?
Yeah, jump in. Yeah, I was hoping you would.
Yeah, I think it's definitely there's a lot more issues, I think, than what you've just touched upon. Yeah. Not the least of which is when you go to somebody who is going to create a file about you, they're approaching you from a deficit-based place. They're trying to figure out what is wrong with you. And in my experience, my personal experience, I didn't find that helpful. I was already coming from a deficit-based place. I already knew that I needed to be fixed, that I was broken. I had been getting those messages all my life. So that absolutely wasn't helpful to me. And unfortunately, our culture, that's what it offers. You're mentioning that we tend not to seek help because we know we won't get the help. It's actually that we know we'll be filtered into a system that will limit our options as we move forward. And so on average, people who start to feel any form of distress are waiting up to 6 years before they even touch base with the mental health system. And that says something about providing options like Hearing Voices Network.
And which speaks to what I had mentioned earlier, that the importance of culture has to do more with how we deal with the issue rather than how it is described. And that speaks to what you're saying, that the approach is more that, okay, this is something that needs to be fixed, rather than an approach of what is going on and why are you sitting today here and talking to me.
I want to grab a caller, too, just before we run. This show is flying by here. Here's Lisa in Simsbury. Hi, Lisa.
Hey, how are you?
Good.
I'm going to have to respectfully disagree with the woman. I'm afraid, is her name Lisa?
Lisa, yeah.
I should know that. Same name. I went into therapy for a completely different reason, and after it had almost been 3 years, it turned out that I had, clearly a dissociative disorder. And it was only when I was, losing time clearly, I'd stopped drinking, and I was clearly losing time, and I would see myself as I'm trying to explain how the different voices and or people came out.
Mm-hmm.
It would be as if your brain was on an axis, and it would turn, and it would turn drastically, or as my therapist would say to me, I would be hijacked. If I was in a situation that I put myself in that I shouldn't have been in, then one of my people would come out and take care of that situation.
I don't mean to cut you off, but we're really almost out of time on the show. I think we're getting back to what Dr. Mahendry said in the first place. What brought you into the psychiatrist's office? What brought you into therapy? What brought you to the clinic? And it sounds like some other stuff brought you there. Whereas I think what you're talking about, Lisa, in the studio, is if you're just hearing voices and that's pretty much it, or that's kind of a different thing, right?
Actually, I was speaking very much from my own personal experience,
Yeah.
so I don't at all want to step on Lisa's experience and her understanding of what was helpful to her. But I definitely find that strength-based approaches are more open and expansive than deficit-based categorization.
We're almost out of time here. I sort of don't dare take another phone call. So very quickly tonight, Peter, do you have a sense of what's going to go on tonight at Real Artways? What the format's going to be? Is it just people meeting, or will you be speaking?
I'm going to do a bit of a presentation about the history of the Hearing Voices movement, my personal journey into recovery. But I think just to finish a bit too, is the importance of the power of the narrative, what brings people to services. I take referrals from psychiatrists who can't work with them, and I listen to their narrative. Then I'm not interested in what they can't do. I'm interested in their resilience and how they survived. And that's where we build from. You're still here, you're still alive. Let's use that as a positive rather than looking at the deficits and what you can't achieve.
Yeah, so that's very consistent, yeah, in 15 seconds.
Which is actually an old an old form of therapy, in the sense Carl Rogers had talked about client-centered or person-centered, which was to build to person's strengths with empathy.
All right, so first of all, I'm really sorry to anybody who was online who I didn't get to. There were some people. But if this is sort of you, if we're talking about you or somebody like you, you might think about going to Real Artways in Hartford. That's tonight from 5:30 to 9. You'll hear presentations. You'll be with other people who are hearers, and that might be a very interesting thing for you. Maybe the first time you've done that. So thanks to everybody who helped out today. Thanks especially to Betsy Kaplan, who pulled this show together for us. We'll be back tomorrow with, of course, as usual, a completely different thing.